Welcome back to Latino Vote with Mike Madrid and Chuck Rocha. We come to you today talking about a number of different issues. We've hit upon some CD races around the state and the country. We've talked a little bit about trends and trend lines. Today, I want to do what I'll call hot topics. And the one that I want to start with, Mike and I had this discussion when we were planning for the show about what do we call ourselves? Are we Latinos? Are we Hispanic? Are we Latinx? That debate continues to rage around the country and in newspapers and in academia. But I am curious, and for the non-Latinos and the the people that haven't studied this, Mike, take us through primarily the Venn diagram analysis of Latino versus Hispanic, right? Talk about that for us, and then we'll go into Latinx.
Yeah, and it feels like sometimes it's a difference without a distinction, but I think it's becoming increasingly more important. The first time I kind of had to deal with this politically was when I was in my early 20s, as a lot of the newly elected Latino leadership that was exploding in California was demanding that the media and others starts referring to them as Latinos as opposed to Hispanic. And again, as somebody who grew up, it was always Hispanic. The Republican National Hispanic Assembly was the organization that I was engaged in and involved in, and Hispanic is the federal government's term for this grouping of quote unquote grouping of people. But the political distinction between Latinos and Hispanics is real simple one. Hispanic refers to any Spanish speaking country, which of course emanates and begins with Spain. Latino is a much more politicized term, meaning essentially that there's a Latin American derivative of where you come from. And that of course has very significant political connotations with European heritage and non-European heritage and kind of the conquest and stuff like that. My real belief is that you're already starting to see, even at the national level, a very significant shift towards talking about Latinos. And I think that will become the common vernacular with our national media in the next few years, mainly because of the distinctiveness of Spain being a country of origin. Now, having said that, there are regions of the country where you do not use Latino. For New Mexico, for example, where my father's people are from, they're Hispanic. Texas, I think in a lot of parts of Texas, I'll leave that to you and Chuck too politically to talk about that. When I was doing races in Texas, Hispanic is by far the language that we used. If you used Hispanic in California, people would literally step back and be like, how old school is that? Right? It's like, who's talking here? Like, what does that even mean?
That's curious though. That's curious to me though, because as you point out, when you say Latino, you're talking about Latin America, right? And so you're in the Venn diagram, it's a subcircle of Hispanics, which would be any Spanish-speaking country in the world, including Cuba or Spain or European. So why would we want to exclude anyone, right? I get it in California because everyone there probably are the majority of the people who are of Hispanic, have Hispanic heritage are Latinos. But, Florida, they're probably not Latinos exclusively, right? Chuck, what do you think?
I think that it's always interesting the way that we look at all of these terms based off of, we always say Latinos are not a monolith and we're from so many different countries. Well, guess what, y'all? We all call ourselves all kinds of different things throughout history. And at one point, because of a census form, they come up with the word name Hispanic, non-white Hispanic, or personally, I don't like using any word that refers to me that has the word panic in it. So I try to stay away from all of that. And if you knew me better, you'd understand that. It's funny growing up in Texas and watching the evolution. I use different terminologies all depending on where I am in what setting, to make sure that I show up. This is very woke of me, and I am very liberal and very left, to what space I'm in. If I'm in New Mexico, where I'm proud to work for the governor there, who is a proud Latina, as Mike said, I ain't never mentioning the word Latino. I'm talking about Hispanic. I'm talking about all kind of Hispanic. And if I'm in and I know you want to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this, but if I'm in a meeting of super left woke brown folks who are doing good work on criminal justice reform, on gender equity, on all the things, environmental justice, right? A lot of times I will use the new vernacular of Latinx, because there are folks in that room who are gender neutral, who are very much not defined to either side of the party, or either side, not the party, but either side of the debate on the name. But I don't use Latinx when I'm communicating with the electorate as a whole in a TV commercial or on a mail piece, because they don't know that term. But it doesn't mean I can't show the due respect to somebody who may be gender neutral or non-binding when it comes to gender, to show that respect to them in a meeting. And that's kind of how, in my mind, I process which term I use and when.
So you've seen the polling on this issue. Latinx is a term primarily got start in academia, right, for people that were writing about this community. But it's not favored not only by people that identify as Republicans, but people that identify as Democrats who happen to be of Hispanic have Hispanic heritage or Hispanic origin. They don't like Latinx either. It's an unpopular term. It seems across the board. Now, I get you're just polite, right? So you're just being a good guy. But in the end, is Latinx going to survive? My sense is it's on its way out, much like, say, Chicano was back in the 70s, or Tejano's different, but I remember being Chicano for a while. And then there was the Mexican American. And to me, Latinx feels like it's going to go the way of the dinosaur. Mike, thoughts on that? You're the professor.
I mean, I do not like the term for a whole lot of reasons. The main reason I don't like it is because it is not used by 97% of the community and the people that it's trying to reach. This was a term developed by academics and academia. I understand the motivation behind it. I think in some ways that was virtuous. I also am not a big believer that academia should be driving culture and cultural discourse. I think that is organic and something that should emanate from the community and from the ground up. So I do have issues with it, because most of my concerns about it are political, and not from a partisan perspective, but just from a tone deaf perspective. It shows how far removed academics and academia has become from real people in the real world. That's the problem with it. It's not that Latinos don't like it or they're viscerally opposed to it, myself excluded, because I don't like it. But it's because it shows, it's basically walking into a room and saying, I'm not one of you. I don't understand you. I don't get you, but this is the way you really should be thinking. And when we talk about cultural elitism, which is a very real thing, you can't have the Democratic Party consolidating college-educated new economy workers as fast as they are, and Republicans consolidating non-college educated workers as fast as they are, without there being a cultural war, which is what we have. And the institutions of both sides try to impose their values set onto society. That's what institutions essentially are constructed to do. Because the left has so dominated academia, this value, this orthodoxy, which you cannot violate, right? This demand that you identify and look at people through certain lenses, which is kind of the wokeism problem on the left, demands that if you don't follow these rules, then you're not tolerant, which is a contradictory statement in and of itself. And it's why there is so much pushback from blue collar workers across the spectrum. And so it should not surprise us. Look, that same polling, the biggest finding is the group that likes the Latinx term and uses it the most are white progressives. It's only 9%, but it's 3 times the size of members of the Latino community. So look, I think people should be referred to the way that they want to be referred to. I think that is just common decency, but I think it's also common decency to respond, to speak to a people the way that they, and I mean people is in the broader community, the way that they want to be communicated to, and this is an affront to that.
I don't think anybody would ever confuse Chuck Rocha and anything that had to do with the word academia just based off of my dialect. But I will go as far as to say, as I see it differently, and I see it as an evolution. Do I think we will evolve into using Latinx? No. But I think that 100 years ago, we used to own Black people and use the N-word like it was anything. But guess what we've done? We've evolved to understand that that wasn't right. And we don't use that word in common vernacular. And we don't, show up in places in that way. Also, the way that we talk about gay people. 100 years ago, you'd be whipped or whatever for being gay and using gay slurs, and we've changed that terminology. So I'm not angry at Mike or at you, Jason. I see it in my mind as somebody, and let me put myself in the spotlight of someone who's evolved themselves. I was as big a redneck and a little bit of a racist when I was a young man. And I've learned as I got older and got to see a larger view of the world, how effed up and my thinking was as a young man who grew up as a white redneck, right? So when I see that term being more accepting of folks who may not identify as a male or a female, I think about my own evolution in that small space. I still am not going to advocate for that word being used to communicate to the masses. I think what I was trying to portray is the way that I feel my own evolution as somebody who is progressive and who wants to see all boats lifted, from somebody who grew up very poor, who didn't have any education, but also knew that the way I looked at the world of race as a young man was stupid. And as I've gotten older, I'm like, oh, now I see how ignorant I really was.
So Latinx is still used commonly within the progressive left, and in your circles of people who are Democrats or left or woke. You're hearing that term regularly. It's not as if it's dying out at that and on your side.
No, and to Mike's point, some of that, and let me agree with him on this. I'm going to push back on this point, but I'll agree on virtue signaling. Like, I can't put up with that shit one moment. Don't show up at me and talk about the need of Black and brown folks and all your consultants are white. You can kiss my ass. Like, this just not going to happen. I'm going to push back on that.
Okay, well, you put it so delicately. Let's switch topics to one that I know that anybody listening to this program will be very interested in your thoughts, both Mike and Chuck, on immigration, both legal and illegal immigration. The former president made it a primary issue for his campaign. Obviously, it not only became part of his movement, but really all Republicans now must be, on board with border security and all those things. And let's be clear, right? There is a need for a secure border. We are a sovereign nation. There are bad people that try to get into the country from the southern border. And so we have to address that. But it's become more than that. It's almost cultural. It's almost, the litmus test for being what is now called a Republican, to be strongly against all kinds of any kind of incursion from the border, legal or illegal. Where do we go with this? I mean, is there going to be a change in the way we perceive this issue as Trumpism begins to be more in the rearview mirror, or is this issue a salient and real issue that will continue to really galvanize both sides on the political aisle? Let me start with Mike this time.
The question of immigration and the undocumented is by far the most visceral, emotional, impactful, and immediate issue I have ever worked on. And it was a very big part of the California discussion in the early and mid 1990s. It's why I was intrigued by the differences between Texans and Californians during that time. In California, you have to remember, in the mid 1990s, we had a ballot measure called Proposition 187, where the voters of California decided and voted 60-40 to make it illegal to provide any government services, emergency rooms, public school education, anything to undocumented and their children. 60-40 in California means you got a hell of a lot of Democrats voting for that too. Okay. And so the Republican Party marched down that path, ultimately to what I believe led to its marginalization and destruction. At the same time, you had a Republican governor by the name of George W. Bush that was saying things like, anybody willing to walk across 300 miles of desert to work for minimum wage is somebody I want working in Texas. And we forget sometimes that Rick Perry, he blew up his second, presidential campaign by being on a stage at a Republican debate by saying, if you're not willing to provide taxpayer dollars to undocumented children, you don't have a heart. And he was booed off stage by Republicans. Texas Republicans historically have been very different, at least in the last 30, 40 years, in approaching the undocumented and the documented immigrant. And that, to me, it's why I started working with the Bush folks. It's why I did work in Texas. It's why I was trying to learn the differences between what Republicans were doing in Texas, which was more forward and progressive thinking, and what Californians were doing, which was very regressive. And the battle for the heart and soul of the Republican Party was going to be which direction that they chose. And up until 2012, it was pretty clear that the consulting class and the people who follow math were saying the best way to go is the George W. Bush routes to build a new permanent majority in this country. Unfortunately, on the way, what happened was Donald Trump tapped into this vein, again, not unlike what we saw even in California and still see in California, where the average Republican voter does not want to see more non-white people in this country. That is just a fact. We can argue one way or the other. I've been having this debate with Republicans, and they'll try to make these bullshit arguments about legal versus illegal. That's all bullshit. Not any one of those people that was saying this is legal versus illegal was complaining during the Trump administration when Steve Miller wanted to reduce legal immigration. It's not about legal or versus illegal. It's about brown versus white. That's what this is about. And in politics, when something is that visceral, that deep-seated, it is extremely hard to move the needle. Here's where the problem is for Democrats and why Republicans can keep running on this for a long, long time. The Democrats have never rallied behind a solution. And what that does is it leaves them exposed to this open borders argument. And I've never yet heard a Democrat argue eloquently, articulately, cleanly, and succinctly about how they are not a supporter of open borders. Because there are elements in the Democratic Party that are open borders. Not many. I don't know many of them, but the fear of being viewed as being anti-Hispanic forces Democratic politicians into a very, very bad place. Because every poll that I have seen in the past 30 years on immigration reform, everyone, including Latinos and including Democrats, begins with one place: increasing border security. That is not a bad thing. Okay, that is a good thing for countries. We should not have undocumented immigration coming into our borders. We are a sovereign nation with the rights to do that. The problem is we can't get to the important part to fix that until we start with border security. And the irony is solving the immigration question is not complicated. It's very easy for both sides. The problem is both sides have a vested interest in motivating their base by not fixing the problem. It allows the Democrats to say the Republicans are racist and mobilize the Hispanic voter base. And it allows Republicans to say they're open borders and they're trying to overturn elections and change our country by allowing brown people in. And that motivates each respective base. And neither politician from either party has any vested interest in solving a very solvable problem.
Chuck, thoughts on that?
You know, it's an issue that's comes up all the time. It's, I want to add to what Mike's saying. I agree with most of it. I think our parties and me and Mike would disagree on certain pieces of this as well. The bottom line is that nothing has happened. And the last thing that Mike said is probably the most important, and y'all should really make sure that you understand that Mike is a registered Republican and I am a yellow dog Democrat, and that we both agree that both parties many times use this issue to their advantage. And as a small business owner, I've got 8 employees, 3 of which were born in another country and that are immigrants. One of which works under the Deferred Action DACA, one that works under TPS, Temporary Protective Status from El Salvador. This immigration as a small business owner hits me directly. And guess what? On top of that, I am a consultant who tries to elect people to fix the problem. So this has been super aggravated for me. And for our community, there was a poll out where almost 70% of the Latino Hispanic population in the country knows someone who's undocumented, family member or friend. And what people don't realize in politics, and this is a show called The Latino Vote, is that there's a personal issue here. And when white pollsters ask the question, and this is the first question they all ask because they all went to the same damn school and they all ask the same damn question is, what's the most important issue that's going to make you vote this cycle? Well, it's going to be your job and your economy and things that help your kids. Like, that's the most important thing. But the most emotional issue that they talk about when you ask somebody their story of how your family got here is that immigration story, going back to what me and Mike talked about on episode 2 with our grandmothers and our mothers and the centerpieces of our community. There's an immigration story behind each one of those women that is told throughout history of a Hispanic or Latino family that is an emotional connection to where they are and who they want to be. And when we talk about immigration as an election issue, sometimes we skate past the issue itself to talk about what the white pollster says we should ask about the economy or the environment or whatever you do with education, because the immigration pulls at the heartstrings of who we are as a community. We walked across that desert that Mike Madrid just talked about, that George Bush said, I'll take that worker if they'll come that far for minimum wage. There's somebody who has that immigration story, and people always ask me, what was the first ad you ran for Bernie Sanders in Nevada? Well, you know what? The pollster told me at the time that jobs in the economy were the number one issue. I said, well, I'll be damned. I've got 8 months to talk to these Latinos. My first ad is going to talk about Bernie Sanders' father immigrating here from another country and not being able to speak English and not having any money. Because what I just did there, girls and boys, is made him relatable to every Latino voter in Nevada whose father or grandfather's story is the exact same, to say, you know what? I don't look like you. I sure as hell don't sound like you, but I come from the same shit you do. And I understand what it's like to come here with no money and a dream and make it happen. That's the way we should be talking about immigration.
This issue will continue to just animate both sides, right? And so I don't know if there's ever going to be a fix based on the reasons why it exists in the first place, right? Because both parties benefit from not addressing it. I remember when I was in the legislature, was trying to do what I could to make a fix from some small things, and it was never it never went anywhere because neither side had an interest. So I fear we're going to continue to have these conversations for the next or for the foreseeable future. Chuck, you'd mentioned in pre-production for episode 3 that there are a number of places around the country where we're seeing pivotal races that will impact who will control the United States Congress. Now, we know 2022 midterms are coming up, and there are a lot of factors that are in play. But tell me about some of the races around the country where you think there's going to be an impact to what happens overall in the Congress.
I don't want to be too dramatic about this or use this new fancy word that I love called hyperbole. I can't even say it, and it sounds so cool that I know what it means, but I'm not using hyperbole. And what I mean by that is what I'm going to say sounds like it really benefits Chuck Rocha and Mike Madrid, but it's just the plain damn truth, which is the Latino vote and Latino voters will determine basically who controls the U.S. House and Senate. And stop your bitching, let me explain. There's 3 Senate races that Democrats are underwater in where there is a ton of Latinos. Let's start with a Latina senator in Nevada. She has to win re-election for us to keep that. Right now, she's under 50%. Mark Kelly in Arizona good shape, raising a lot of money, but it's Arizona in an off-year election. Turnout will not be what it was for that. It's not a blue state. It is still a light red state. And Raphael Warnock in Georgia. Let's be clear. Georgia in a non-presidential year does not perform like a presidential year. Yes, Stacey Abrams, I love her. She's running for governor. She's going to get a lot of folks out, but it's still an off year. So there's your 3 Senate states. And 12 House seats are literally 50-50 House races. That means that there are 50 to 51% Democrat or Republican. They're right down the middle. And of those 12 girls and boys, 6 of them have Latino populations of over 40%. Let me go through them really quickly. Texas 15, we talked about in episode 2. New Mexico 2, that's the Southern District of New Mexico. Colorado 8, a new district that's been written just north of Denver. And then Mike Madrid knows these better than me. California 22, California 27, California 45. So all of those districts are heavy Latino populations and will determine if we lose all of those seats and you don't get Latinos voting for Democrats and Republicans continue to make inroads, it's going to be a very, very bad day for Democrats. And this will be the shining light, because we've never in the history of American politics had this many marginal seats that had this percentage of Latino population since I've been doing campaigns, and I'm on my 32nd year.
We should patent what's going to happen next, and that is the Mike Madrid math moment. As we found on episodes 1 and 2, Mike's a repository of all things relating to data and mathematical projections. So talk to us a little about what Chuck just said from your perspective, using the numbers.
Well, look, Chuck, I mean, I think he set it up very eloquently, and he's actually 100% right. I will say this again, Chuck and I have been around a long time, and we have heard this in the sleeping giant vernacular, and the Latinos are going to make a big difference, and blah 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 blah. Chuck is 100% dead on right. This is the year where those margins are going to make a difference in who controls the Senate and the House in enough seats. The Hispanic Latino vote, up until the last 6-8 years, has been a very regional vote. It's been largely isolated in states like Texas, like California, like New York. I'm setting Florida aside for one important reason. States that were largely decided. And with you can't really gerrymander much without bringing in Latino voters anymore, is essentially what is happening. And so when 6 of the most competitive House races and 3 of the most competitive U.S. Senate races have a discernible vote of Latino voters that are going to be determinative, it is absolutely entirely accurate to say that the road to the future of democracy and control of the legislature are going to go through Latino households. Joe Biden won Georgia by about 15,000 votes. There's 30,000 Mexican American voters in Georgia. So turnout is going to have to include a constituency that Georgians haven't really targeted or worked on before. You can't carry Maricopa County in Arizona without a very significant share of the Latino Hispanic vote to win statewide in Arizona. Mark Kelly is going to need not just a robust turnout, but a significant break vote share of the Hispanic vote. And Nevada, Clark County is the key. It's why Reed, invested so heavily early on with that vote there. It's just for the first time, it's just not debatable. It is just math. It's the roadmap to power. And for the first time in my 30 years of doing this, it's impossible to say anything other than that and state that as fact.
I'm going to close on that. You cannot overstate the importance of the Latino vote. That's why we came together to do this show. This is why we have to get this information into the general public by people who understand these issues, because they're on the bleeding edge of what's happening politically and around the country. And because they come from different sides of the political aisle, we have the benefit of your perspective. I think 2022 is just the beginning. Frankly, the future president of the United States, whoever that may be, is going to have to court Hispanics in a way that we probably haven't seen in the past. And I think going forward, it'll continue to evolve. I know in Texas, we've seen a market shift in the way people are attempting to engage Latinos in a more meaningful way, from the governor all the way down. So we are truly shaping and changing the way politics are done in the country. Gentlemen, thank you again for your time. It's always a pleasure hearing from you. We'll be back with episode 4 shortly, but for right now, thanks and have a great week. And join us again on Latino Vote with Mike Madrid and the great Chuck Rocha. Signing off.